Okay, thank you very much for our guests, Dr. Tim Anderson and Mr. Arnaud de Velay. Today we would like to talk about International Court of Justice in Dutch, I think, yeah. But before we discussing this issue, let me introduce. South Africa succeed in destroying apartheid system. Now South Africa is filing lawsuit against Israel genocide in Gaza at the International Court of Justice, 28 December 2024, for the first time in the history of human justice in the world. Previously, South Africa was at the home of World Palestinian Solidarity Conference 3 until 5 December 2023 of 150 delegates from 72 countries. South Africa has a voice of the world, the extent of which South Africa's effort are significant for the struggle for Palestinian independence is maximal at the international court level. Can South Africa stop Israel genocide in Gaza? This is the main question of our discussion. Okay, let ask to the Dr. Tim Anderson. You attended the conference. What is the meaning of the International Conference on Palestine Solidarity in Johannesburg, South Africa? Tell me, Doctor.
Okay, so this was a conference organized by the Global Campaign for the Return to Palestine, which is something really organized out of the Arab countries, but the host in this occasion was South Africa. And the chair of the conference was Mandla Mandela, who's one of the grandsons of Nelson Mandela. He is one of the chiefs and head of the Mandela Foundation and an ANC member of parliament. And I think that was very important because I think South Africans have a unique perspective on the Palestinian struggle, in particular as regards the bad compromises that are set up along the way, like the so-called two-state solution. They understand this because they went through it themselves. There's attempts to divide the campaign, to divert the campaign into other areas, for example. So in the end, that was a campaign which simply came up with a charter which was a declaration in support of the Palestinian struggle. Significant, I think, that Mandla Mandela himself took many of the leaders of the resistance in Palestine and Lebanon into Government House in Pretoria, held their hands under the statue of Nelson Mandela. And so, in other words, it was seen as a very strong show of support from at least a section of the ANC in South Africa for the resistance. Now, this is significant because in Western countries, Palestine is very popular, but probably it's popular amongst a wide group of people. Sometimes they see it as simply an anti-war or a pacifist cause or something that is not really linked to armed struggle. But the South Africans have had their own experience of that. Of course, Nelson Mandela pioneered created the armed wing of the ANC in the early 1960s. That's what he was jailed for. They realized in the African National Congress that at a certain stage, when there's no other options, that armed struggle is an option, and one that is now recognized well, partly as a result of the South African struggle in international law. Occupied people have the right to resist in all appropriate means, including armed struggle in the right circumstances. So I think it's very important to have South African voices these days, both at that conference in Johannesburg, and now again, of course, it's the South African state that is running this action at the International Court of Justice there. I don't think that the ICJ is going to abolish the apartheid regime in occupied Palestine, but it's going to be an important step along the way, and it will provide new tools for the campaign to liberate Palestine and dismantle the apartheid regime in occupied Palestine.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. We will ask you to give more information about two-state solution and one-state solution. But for Mr. Arnaud, as a lawyer, I want to ask you, what does it mean for South Africa to file Israel's lawsuit with the International Court of Justice alleging a genocide? What about the judge position? Will they to be objective?
Well, we can only hope so if they are fulfilling the role which is assigned to them as basically a magistrate. I mean, let's not forget that the ICJ, International Court of Justice for viewers, is essentially the quote unquote the judicial branch of the UN. So to the extent South Africa and the Zionist entity, as it were, have both ratified the Genocide Convention. They are both bound by its provision. And to the extent this crime is characterized in fact and at law, we should expect the ICJ to find that there is indeed a genocide going on in Gaza as we speak, and to take remedial action. So this remedial action is expected to take place under the shape of an injunction. And as Dr. Anderson mentioned, this would be but the platform, the launching, the springboard for additional measures taken against Tel Aviv, be it under the form of sanctions, and maybe if we go by the analysis of Dr. Francis Boyle, we might see some remedial action under Article 22 of the UN Charter going through the General Assembly, because we can expect, of course, the Security Council to veto via the United States any kind of initiative. So we have to keep a close look on the proceedings. From what I understand, we expect the court to render its opinion later on this month. And so we're all waiting and observing with bated breath for what is essentially an unprecedented initiative aimed at calling a spade and basically ostracizing this regime, which is the only regime in the world today remaining. It's a kind of kind of a relic of a 20th century rogue state, openly acting against an entire population. So we'll have to see. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of wrangling behind the scenes. We can expect it. I think the Israeli defense lawyers, so to speak, the way they presented the argument yesterday is a appetizer of to what land they may go to try to reframe the argument and somehow distort the facts on the ground. So we'll see what happens.
Okay, Mr. Arnaud, we know that my question is how far the spectrum of genocide case in Gaza if we compare with the Yugoslavia and Rwanda? What is the difference?
Well, the difference is that in the case of the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, we were in presence of of Security Council resolutions, in as far as they created those ad hoc tribunals. Whereas here, it's an initiative that basically, aims at declaring the current action of the Israeli government as violative of their obligation under the Genocide Convention. And so we can hope that the General Assembly will pick up the tab afterward and run with it. Under what shape, what form the General Assembly will then act on what we should expect will be an injunction to stop essentially violating of the convention by the Israelis. This remains to be seen. But the main difference, again, is that we are bypassing the Security Council.
Okay, Dr. Tim Anderson, you mentioning before about two-state solution and the effort of the South Africa to international court. You know that as a member of ratified, as a member of International Court of Justice, it is become a burden or not? My question is to what extent can this effort contribute to the Palestinian independence? Because you know that you are always talking about one-state solution, and if we are reading about the proceeding South Africa proceeding, I see that South Africa admitted two-state solution, mentioning referring to the 1977 border. What do you think?
So there's quite a current in international discussions talking about a return to 1967 borders, which was the time when the Israelis annexed all of the Palestinian territories, apart from what's called these days 1948 Palestine. But the idea of return to 1967 borders is really a rather outdated one, and it's the basis of the so-called two-state solution. It gets repeated in UN Security Council resolutions when they talk about the peaceful resolution of the so-called Palestinian-Israeli conflict. But it's an outdated one, I suggest, because it's been repeated really since 1947, 1948. It was recommended back in the 40s before the Israeli regime was created. But there has been no serious attempt by an Israeli regime or a US government to seriously create an Arab state. There have been talks over the years, and if you look at the leading US academic on this, Rashid Khalidi, he points out that never has there been a serious suggestion of an independent sovereign Arab state in historic Palestine there. Neither the Israelis nor the US have supported it there. But it's held out as a type of a cruel illusion by the US, and the Biden administration has repeated it recently. Many other international players repeat it because it has this apparent authenticity in the Security Council resolutions repeated since 1967. However, since then, we've got a new reality, haven't we? We've got 6 independent reports in the last 10 years or so, branding the Israelis as an apartheid regime, as practicing systematic racism against the Palestinian people, who form at least half, a little bit over half, the population in historic Palestine there. So that changes things. And of course, the genocide case changes things too. In other words, if there is to be recognition of an apartheid regime, this is against international law too, because the international law since the 1970s, based on the South African experience, is that an apartheid regime is a crime against humanity, and it's a crime to support it, to recognize it, to give it any comfort or supply, for example. On that basis, you could say the state of Yemen these days, the revolutionary government in Yemen, is complying with international law by trying to cut off and isolate an apartheid regime that's carrying out genocidal practice. If the International Court of Justice gives some provisional approval to this genocide charge, which the South Africans have argued, and what they're arguing at the moment, by the way, is provisional measures. The initial hearing is about will the ICG do something temporarily, and the main thing they're asking for is a complete end to the Israeli military operations in Gaza. That will lend greater credibility to the charges against Israel as an apartheid state and one which is engaging in genocide. So in other words, really the idea of 2 states is incompatible with the recognition of an apartheid regime which practices genocide. And in those circumstances, the only viable long-term political solution, and one that I think South Africans like Mandela Mandela, if not the government at this stage, because the South African government at this stage is really a little bit divided on the issue, and they still have diplomatic relations with the Israelis, even though they've been downgraded. But the sharper minds in South Africa are saying this idea of 2 states, which was last articulated by the Trump administration, is really the same as the Bantustan proposals in South Africa back in the 70s and 80s, which was creating tribal homelands, small, isolated, unviable, resource-poor areas which were able to divide up the so-called native population, even with third-rate educational systems, which is also what the Trump administration was suggesting, that the Israelis control the education system in some sort of Palestinian statelet, which would be dominated by the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis, and not have any control over its borders or its commerce or its security and so on. This was very like the Bantustan solution in South Africa. And of course, with that experience and with the moral authority of their experience and their achievements in abolishing apartheid, I think those South African voices are very important, even if there seem to be some mixed signals coming from the South African government. So for all those reasons, I think that the idea of 2 states is totally obsolete. We are facing an apartheid regime, which is now being faced with very powerful, credible charges of genocide against the discriminated against population. And in those circumstances, I think the whole issue of talking about 2 states in international law is coming to an end.
Okay, Dr. Trim, are you trying to say that, 2-state solution parallel with the Bantustan case? But in another opinion, you are trying to propose dismantling apartheid system. But what court can bring Israel criminal from since 1948? Because we see that this court only since 1967. What is your comment?
Yes, as Arnaud pointed out, there's an Irish-American lawyer, Francis Boyle, who has talked about the possible outcomes of this case, and he talks about the parallel powers of the General Assembly as against the Security Council. We know the Security Council has 3 NATO members who are all sponsors of the Israeli regime, that Britain, France, and the US. And in the General Assembly, of course, the developing countries, the former colonized countries, have the numbers there, basically. So in that circumstance, apparently, according to Francis Boyle, if the Security Council does nothing as a result of a ruling by the ICJ against the Israelis, it's possible for the General Assembly to vote for, first of all, suspending the membership of the Israelis in the United Nations. Second of all, creating a court to bring to justice the criminals that have been involved in the genocide in this case. And thirdly, to impose sanctions on the Israeli regime. And that's, of course, parallels some of the processes that happened against apartheid South Africa, at least the idea of strengthening the sanctions, strengthening the isolation of the Israeli regime.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tim. Mr. Arnaud, I want to ask you about the procedure of the court, step by step, until the final decision of the judge. Can you tell me about the procedure of the International Court of Justice if we compare with another court of justice, international justice?
Well, I would say the main difference is that not unlike what we call the Cour de Cassation in at civil law countries, the ICJ's mandate is to enforce UN instruments. So to the extent the Israelis and the South African, for the matter at issue, are concerned, both of them are signatories of the convention, and South Africa basically takes the initiative. They file a case against the ICJ, denouncing the non-observance of the Genocide Convention, 1948 Genocide Convention by the Israelis. And so right now it's more an issue of establishing at law, basically the violation by one of the most important international instrument by a UN member, or a so-called UN member who wishes to be part of the international community and be considered as such, as a bona fide state. To the extent the Israelis are found in violation of their obligation under this convention, then a series of steps are required to have them, quote unquote, cease and desist from engaging in such actions. So it's more right now a matter of establishing at laws the violation of a UN member state of a fundamental international instrument, which is what the ICJ does. The ICJ is the enforcers of UN member states' obligation in thus far as UN filed and registered international instruments. This is the basic, this is the springboard, out of which we hope a series of action initiative will be implemented, again, most likely through the General Assembly, since we know the Security Council is pretty much a deadlocked institution, as we saw again a couple of days ago with the latest resolution bearing on the so-called international maritime coalition against the Houthis. But I wanted to come back to what Dr. Anderson was mentioning earlier as far as the two-state solution. In 2004, the International Court of Justice actually issued an advisory opinion bearing on the separation wall, and already at the time alluded to the patent illegality of basically this wall as representative of apartheid. And Zionism as a concept was, back in the 70s, the object of a resolution. I think it was a General Assembly resolution, but it still stands today, basically characterizing Zionism as a form of racism. Back in 2001, at the Durban Convention, we also had some kind of joint declaration, basically calling Zionism racism. So this is nothing new, and to the extent, as Tim said, we've been hearing about the two-state solution mantra. I dare to say that that train has left the station a long time ago. I mean, let's not forget that owing to what was initially the 1947 partition plan, and I would recommend our listeners and viewers to read Ilan Pape's book on this era. We witnessed, a first ethnic cleansing, and about three-quarter of a million Palestinians were evicted out of their homes. And essentially, through the so-called Oslo peace accord, the Israelis have been trying to hoodwink the international community for now over 25 years by thinking that the two-state solution was the way out of it. But what we failed to take into account is that settlements have been built at breakneck speed in the West Bank to such an extent that a viable state, a Palestinian state, as Tim underlined, as of today, under the current metrics, is basically a chimera. I mean, it's completely ridiculous, and it would be amounting to Bantustan, not unlike what we saw in South Africa. The Israeli at the time were proposing or offering some kind of a state with limited action on its own security, on its own airports, as far as oversight over what comes in and comes out. So let us, be honest about it. This is not what a viable state is about. So, but the problem is that this two-state solution hogwash has been penetrating popular opinion, popular consciousness for so long now that we all think somehow that this is the way out. I would basically suggest that the geographical area of historic Palestine should become a state for all its citizens, and this will require dismantling the Zionist ideology, as a predicate. So we have a long way to go, because Zionism has to be denounced and has to be brought down before we can seriously talk about any kind of viable solution for the Palestinians and the Israelis. Keeping in mind that you have Israelis of Arab descent as well, who on paper might seem as if they have equal rights with the Israelis, but it's not quite as simple either. So you have to cut the Gordian knot and basically look for a solution which is one state for all of its people. This is an opinion that's been endorsed by a lot of Israeli scholars, to the extent they have good faith in approaching the problem. But people like Shlomo Sand have written about it, and this would appear to me like the only solution. I can hardly see any kind of alternative, such as what we might have heard about a confederation. To the extent Zionism remains as the core principle, basically making a difference between people on the basis of their religion, but some would say of their ethnicity. This is a non-starter. We heard also about the Arab Peace Initiative, the 2002 Saudi Peace Initiative, which basically calls for a return to the 1967 borders. But this again would require, tackling the main and central issue, the elephant in the middle of the room, which is again the problem with Zionism. As long as Zionism rules the day in that part of the world, you can't seriously begin talking about how, technically speaking, you can, come up with a solution that is amenable to all parties involved.
Okay, Dr. Tim, we know that as International Court of Justice, like Indonesia is not binding because Indonesia not ratify, not as a member. So Do you think that International Court of Justice itself is necessary, yeah, and necessary recognizing the entity of Israel as a state? What do you think?
Look, it's the United Nations that recognised Israel as a state, and it can withdraw that recognition too. As we said before, if if there is a ruling from the ICJ in temporary measures, and then when the case is finalised on the merits, and if, as Arnaud and I said, it's unlikely to go anywhere in the Security Council, the General Assembly can still do things which will affect members. In other words, if the General Assembly says, okay, we're going to suspend Israel from the United Nations, we're going to declare sanctions against the Israelis until they dismantle a racist system, which is committing genocide, then that will give a great deal of a boost to the General Assembly to be able to pass some relevant measures which would isolate that regime. In a way that apartheid South Africa was isolated. So, for example, the Republic of Indonesia, for example, would be strengthened, or every state would be strengthened in saying, okay, we're going to, whatever relations we have with these genocidal apartheid regime, we're going to cut those relations now because we are getting the message from the International Court of Justice and from the General Assembly. And so that level of isolation will place a lot of pressure for a dismantling of the regime. I actually am of the opinion that this current regime led by Netanyahu is very vulnerable anyway. They don't have the support of even the Israeli people, even though there is serious mass fascism in the Israeli state itself. And the so-called liberal side of the Zionists do not predominate in the colony, so to speak, but they do in North America. And so you have this tension between the North Americans and the Biden administration, but also the North American Jewish people too, who hate Netanyahu almost as much as they hate the Palestinian resistance, So you have these terrible contradictions which could lead to a collapse in the current Israeli regime. If that happened, there would be a scramble to try and reconstruct some sort of regime, possibly through an international conference. And of course, in that case, the sponsors of the old regime, the British and the French and the North Americans, will be trying to put together some sort of compromise regime that they find acceptable. At that time, it would be very important for the Palestinians and their allies to get into the game, because even if, for example, every resident in historic Palestine were acknowledged as having full citizenship rights, in other words, the abolition of an apartheid system, a democratic state, you still have the problems that were faced by other racial states like Zimbabwe, like South Africa, that you have the problem of land justice, which was a terrible problem in Zimbabwe and still a problem in South Africa. And you have the problem of the refugees. You have something like 12 to 14 million Palestinian refugees. That, as the UN rapporteur on the position of the Palestinian people, Francesca Albanese, pointed out, is not going to be solved even by the abolition of apartheid. So you have land, you have war crimes, you have the position of the refugees that are questions still to be sorted out, and probably could only be sorted out by an international conference, which might be expedited if there were a collapse of the current regime. And I think there are a number of reasons to suggest that it's very fragile. One is that the Israeli military is effectively disrupted and basically defeated by the serious attack in October last year. It's relying very heavily on international arms and international support in a quite a parallel way to the way that the Kiev regime in Ukraine is relying on that sort of support. You can see if the military support for the Kiev regime in Ukraine was withdrawn, that whole war with Russia will collapse very quickly. Well, I suggest that it's quite a similar situation with the Israelis at the moment. They're only surviving really against, let's remember that they've got a declared war from the Yemenis in the south, and Israel occupies part of Yemen, Socotra Island at least. They've got the prospect of a war with Hezbollah. They've got an ongoing low-level war happening in northern occupied Palestine from the Hezbollah resistance group in Lebanon. They've got Iraqis engaged in some operations against the US bases in Iraq and Syria and against Israeli bases in occupied Palestine. So there's the potential for a much greater conflict. And in those circumstances, the Israeli regime is not looking very stable at all. It doesn't even have internal support. There's a lot of recriminations in the internal regime. So I suggest we could see some dramatic changes very soon, and that would require people to think very quickly about what's going to be reconstructed in its place.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tim. I want to ask you, both of you, but before I ask you about your message to the public, let me summarize that this effort of the South Africa, we have two targets, minimum target and maximum target. Minimum target is far, and maximum target is destroying ideology of Zionism, which is the main problem of this issue. Okay, Mr. Arnold, what is your message to the South Africa, or to the maybe to the axis of resistance, or to the world addressing to this issue? What is your message?
Well, my message is keep keep going at it. You know, it's going to be it's a struggle, to be sure, one that's been going on for decades, and it's just not going to fall by the wayside by snapping of a finger. The Israeli project receives the backup of a very powerful interest. It has geopolitical implication for some of the aforementioned states who all yield veto power in the Security Council. So all those countries have vested interest in seeing that the Israeli colonial project remains in place. Some would say as the immovable aircraft carrier in the region, although I tend to dispute such characterization. But to be sure, it's going to take some perseverance and concentration. As Tim said, the regime is fragilized now, but the saying, the beast is never more dangerous when it's mortally wounded, as it were. What I think we need to now really be weary about is the risk of a spreading of the instability in the region, because as the regime feels threatened at its very foundation, the temptation, especially for someone with a psychological profile like the Jabotinsky inhibited Benjamin Netanyahu is concerned, is to try to double down and bring the United States into a wider conflict, which we can only speculate as to the outcome. Let's not forget that we have a prime minister who has been heavily contested within his own population. The Israeli Supreme Court recently actually struck down that draft law that was actually at the core of the civil unrest we've seen there for the last at least 18 months now, which would basically allow him to pick the judges to sit in his own judgment. So, the project itself is quite fragilized from the inside. And this vaunted Israeli democracy, Jewish and democratic, as we hear all the time, itself is really hailing, as it were. But again, when we look at the composition of the current cabinet, it's full of messianic, far-right, Kahanist elements who, in a way, have been so vocal about their sheer hatred of the other, i.e. the Palestinian, that in thus far as the current proceedings before the ICJ, it should be a no-brainer that the ICJ will characterize the intent. Everyone seems to be focusing on the intent element, the specific intent at the heart of the crime of genocide. I think we have plenty of evidence that that current brand of this current cabinet is really, itself not hiding its intention to eradicate an entire population. Obviously, the aim and the goals behind this ethnic cleansing is not the subject of our discussion today, but owing to some of the economic interest behind this operation, we can expect the Zionist entities, the staunchest backers, to make sure that somehow they escape punishment. or at least that their actions are somewhat obfuscated in such a way that they get away with it one more time. But we'll see what happens. But this is it now. If we don't get this going through the current proceedings in a meaningful way, which would then lead to innovative approaches at the UN within the UN system, bearing on bringing this regime into accountability, uh, we will be left wanting in the eye of history, I believe.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Arnold. Dr. Tim, we know that ICJ as a civilized instrument. Yeah, let's say that state actor, South Africa, a state actor struggling to support independence of Palestine. And another time, we know about prosperity guidance operations and addressing to the Houthi Yemen's fighter supporting Palestine. And Houthi Yemen is what we call a non-state actor. So, what is your comment about two kind of entity?
Well, first of all, I'd like to clarify that I think that contrary to the UN Security Council, the National Salvation Government in Yemen is actually a real government which has controlled 70% of the country since 2015. The UN Security Council, in my opinion, was very wrong to characterize that coalition led by Ansarallah and with elements from the Hadi administration and other people and the National Army as Houthi rebels. They began as Houthi rebels. They created a party called Ansarallah. Ansarallah created a coalition. They would have taken over the whole country, except that there was this intervention led by the US and the Saudis to create that dirty war that went on for many years. And the UN Security Council itself is responsible for the siege on that country on the basis that it is not really a government in Sana'a. It's a destabilizing paramilitary group of some sort. No, they control the armed forces. They control 70% of the country, basically. So in those circumstances, I think that we should recognize that there is a revolutionary government with its headquarters in Sana'a, and it's the Yemeni armed forces which have been imposing that naval blockade that seeks to resupply the Zionist regime. There's a way to look at this that says that Yemen, the Republic of Yemen, which went through a revolution between 2011 and 2015, is complying with its obligations under the Genocide Convention to prevent and punish the crime of genocide by denying supply to the Israeli regime in a way that the British and the Americans are not their accomplices in the crimes, in the slaughter that's being carried out in Gaza. So there's a way to say that this is not really to do with freedom of navigation. They, the Yemeni government, the National Salvation Government, has said that they are only trying to interdict shipping that's resupplying the Israeli regime. And if other ships leave there tracking on and communicate with them, they'll go through safely. On the other hand, the escalation by the British and the Americans, the attacks on Yemen are much more likely to lead to a definitive closing of the Red Sea to shipping, because I think this is why the Europeans didn't want to get involved in the coalition. They saw that the leadership of the US was inclined to escalation, and they saw that escalation was more likely to definitively cut off their shipping rather than talking to the Yemeni authorities and saying, well, no, this is a ship going from China to Belgium or something and not resupplying Israel. So I think that there's a lot of doublespeak about this freedom of navigation between the Anglo-Americans now, as we see what the West comes down to. It's really the Anglo-Americans. The Europeans have bailed out of this idea of having a coalition led by the US in the Red Sea. They didn't like that. They wanted to send in, I think, France and Italy, for example, Belgium, wanted to send in their own escorts for their ships because they didn't trust the US leadership there. Someone else has pointed out, I think one of the North American Jewish commentators, that of course the Israelis have been interfering with freedom of navigation in the Mediterranean by destroying the Palestinian fleet, the fishing fleet from Gaza, basically. So in the name of freedom of navigation, which they denied to the Palestinians in Gaza, they're now attacking the Yemenis, and of course leading to an escalation, which it seemed until fairly recently, almost all of the regional powers, including Iran, including Hezbollah, were trying to avoid escalation, because escalation by its nature is unpredictable. No one knows how far it's going to go. And there are a couple of Iranian ships in the Hodeidah port at the moment. So there are some risks there, although I think Iran has been very restrained up until now. But one thing I'd like to come back to, since you're starting to wrap things up, is to say that let's get clear about the political objectives here. If things start to fall apart very quickly, we are talking about a single democratic state in historic Palestine with equal rights for all those who live there. And this is rather like the South African path, let's say, but with an eye to land justice, to justice for the refugees, really. So a single democratic state with equal rights for all is a more positive way to put it than perhaps destroying Zionism, though it's true that a racist ideology can't live in a democratic state. Of course, those two go together. But I think if the political objectives are a little bit clearer like that, what are they struggling for? When people say free Palestine, what do they mean? They're not talking about some little crippled Bantustan state there, which is totally dominated by the Israeli Palestinian Authority. We're talking about a single democratic state with equal rights for all. I think that's important to bear in mind.
Thank you, Dr. Tim. Back to Mr. Arnaud. I think the Western Bloc frightened about establishing one democratic state, I think, yeah. And thank you very much. We can talk on another issue about the maybe narration of axis of resistance in another segment. Thank you very much for having us. Thank you.
Terima kasih.
Thank you.